International news now.
So we're going to start with news on the investigation into Russian meddling in the 2016 presidential election. We've covered this story throughout the semester as the special prosecutor Robert Mueller has been building his case on possible collusion between members of the Trump campaign team and then his administration and the Russian government. As you will remember, we covered developments of indictments against Paul Manafort, Trump's former campaign manager, and George Papadopoulos, a foreign policy advisor for the Trump campaign, who pleaded guilty to making false statements to the FBI and then started to cooperate with the Mueller investigation. The latest development involves Michael Flynn, who was briefly the national security advisor for President Trump before he was fired by Trump for lying to Vice President Pence about his contacts with Russian officials. Flynn has now pled guilty to lying to the FBI about his Russian contacts and is now cooperating with the Mueller investigation. So first we're going to listen to an audio clip from NPR that provides some background and analysis about what to expect next from this investigation. So let's roll that clip.
One of his lawyers now says President Trump did not really say what he seemed to say on Twitter. John Dowd contends that he was the author of a tweet about former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. Dowd adds he didn't word it very well. It's awkward because the tweet arguably implicated the President of the United States in a crime. Preet Bharara is the former U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York until he was dismissed by President Trump. He's on the line. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
So let's just remember the basics here. It was after the charging of Michael Flynn for lying to the FBI. Trump's Twitter account says, quote, "I had to fire General Flynn because he lied to the vice president and the FBI." Why does that matter?
Well, it matters because it's a change from what the reasoning was that was given by the president in the first place. You know, a few days after he became the national security advisor, the president said only that he fired Michael Flynn because he had lied to the vice president. And now you have the interjection of a new reason, apparently, which was that the president knew that there was a lie to the FBI, which then suggests that if he did that and knew that before he asked Jim Comey back off on the FBI director to back off investigation, that shows a level of knowledge and intent that was previously unknown.
Oh, and the key thing here is lying in general is not a crime, but lying to the FBI in an investigation is very specifically a crime. So the president is saying, I knew Mike Flynn committed a crime and then tried to get the prosecutors to go easy on him.
That's the theory. And now, as you point out, his lawyer, one of his lawyers, John Dowd, says, well, no, it wasn't the president, it was me, in an apparent attempt to try to mitigate the damage to the president.
Is obstruction of justice then the crime that you would throw at the president's feet or lay at the president's feet?
Well, I'm not prepared to lay anything directly at the president's feet just yet, but it's clearly one of the things that's being looked at by Special Counsel Mueller and his team, and it certainly doesn't help the president and his folks in connection with the potential obstruction accusation.
So John Dowd has made a number of statements since taking responsibility for this tweet that he says was sloppily worded, and one of them gets to this question of obstruction of justice by the president. John Dowd, talking to Mike Allen of Axios, says over the weekend, quote, "The president cannot obstruct justice because he is the chief law enforcement officer under the Constitution and has every right to express his view of any case." Do you think that is correct, that you really can't make this case at all because it's the president of the United States?
Look, he's the president's defense lawyer, and he has to say things in the press and in the media that defend the president. I have a lot of experience with John Dowd. He represented some high-profile people in cases before my office. And he said then, as he's saying now, a lot of incorrect, mistaken, and on occasion ludicrous things, so I don't put a lot of stock in it.
Meaning you think that the president can be charged with obstruction of justice?
Yeah, I think it's a very high bar. It's a very high threshold. It's a difficult thing. It's never been done before. But the mere fact that the president is the president doesn't immunize him from an accusation of obstruction.
When you read the news about Michael Flynn being charged with lying to the FBI, not being charged with other things that he potentially could have been, and saying that he's now telling his story and cooperating with federal prosecutors, what does that tell you about the direction of the Robert Mueller investigation?
Well, this is maybe a little bit unsatisfying. I don't think we know for sure. On the one hand, a lot of people are saying it means he must have a sweetheart deal and he must have gotten sort of off lightly because he has a lot of other information. But I don't know that to be true. It's possible that this is all Bob Mueller has. It's also possible that there may be future charges to come down the pike. But in the ordinary course, if he was in fact guilty of more crimes than he's been charged with, that all would have been part of a guilty plea proceeding now as we speak. So I think we have to see.
I actually appreciate you saying what you don't know. Thank you very much. But
Yes.
With that said, do you see any indication that this investigation could be near its end, which apparently is a thing that the president has been saying to people around him?
No, I don't. And look, I think that this team is moving very quickly, but there's a lot still to happen. We have charges pending against Paul Manafort and another gentleman, and that's going to take a bit of time to finish, wrap up, and get to a jury.
Mr. Barrara, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's former United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Preet Bharara.
So let me make a few points. First, in the guilty plea, Flynn admits to lying to the FBI about his Russian contacts. This is a crime, it's a felony, and it lies at the root of his plea deal. He's trying to protect himself and also his son, who is a subject of Mueller's investigation as well. Second, why does this matter? We already knew that Flynn had contacts with Russian officials and lied about it. As the NPR story points out, what may come out of the testimony of Flynn is some information that may support charges that President Trump tried to obstruct justice when he seemingly interceded with the then FBI Director James Comey to, quote, take it easy on Flynn during the FBI investigation, and then fired Comey from his position as the FBI Director. So if Trump knew Flynn lied to the FBI and fired him in part for misleading the FBI, then his support for Flynn after the firing is more suspicious. Now, third, the court documents provide some details about what Michael Flynn discussed with the Russians. Again, he denied ever discussing the Obama administration's sanctions that were imposed on Russia in retaliation for interfering in the American elections, and that happened in late December of 2016. However, in his plea, Flynn admits to talking with Russian officials and convincing them not to escalate the crisis after the Obama administration imposed these sanctions. Again, these conversations happened at the end of December 2016, before the Trump administration has taken office. Now, typically, Russia would have imposed its own sanctions on the United States, but President Putin refrained from doing so. The court documents show that this was arranged through Flynn's contacts. Now, finally, court documents and press investigations suggest that Flynn did not act alone. This also contradicts statements by the White House, which depicted Flynn as a renegade who acted on his own to make contacts without direction from the president or members of his team. Instead, top members of the transition team, in particular Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, and a senior advisor, seem to know of these contacts.
Sort of a bunch of other people they list, right?
Yeah.
Rents,
So,
pre-biz, everybody else.
yeah, this may implicate further members of Trump's inner circle. Now, a few important questions remain. First, does Flynn have information about contacts between the Trump team and Russian authorities during the campaign? And be careful here on this question, and there's been a huge blow up at ABC News over this. ABC News' Brian Ross reported incorrectly last Friday that he had a source that said Flynn was making these contacts with Russia during the campaign before the election. ABC News issued a correction. The source was wrong. It's clear that he only had one source. This was not strong journalism. There were leaked conversations within ABC News from yesterday. The ABC News president went ballistic, screaming at his news team for this screw-up. Ross has been suspended for 4 weeks. There are significant doubts about whether anybody in ABC News wants to work with him after this. Why? Because it feeds into the larger fake news story. It was an incorrect story. And again, what's critical here is the timing. Why did Ross run with this story? Because he thought he had one source that said that there were contacts between Flynn and the Russians prior to the election, which opens up the story about collusion. Right. That didn't happen. The source was incorrect. Ryan was incorrect. But ABC News brand was hurt by this, and that's why the president of ABC News is so upset.
Well, and just be clear, contacts from Flynn as part of a administration that's coming into power isn't necessarily problematic, right?
This happens.
This happens. These things aren't, that's not where the charge of collusion is going to come from. Rather, it's if during the campaign there were contacts with Russia prior to getting elected that all the trouble comes from, especially flowing from the fact that Russia tried to intervene in the election to influence the outcome, then that smacks of some sort of quid pro quo exchange.
Well, and so we need to be careful here. Contacts on their own before the election doesn't necessarily mean anything bad happened. These contacts happen all the time. The question is, within these contacts, was there collusion in exchange for helpful information from the Russians that would hurt Hillary Clinton in the campaign, in exchange for policy concessions that would emerge after Trump? That's the focus of the collusion. But we can't know if there's collusion simply if that there were contacts prior to the election. But this was the problem for the ABC News story, because they seemed to suggest that there were these contacts, and by implication, then this raised the possibility that they had evidence of collusion, which they didn't. Second big question I want to think about here: will these disclosures ultimately be sufficient to prove obstruction of justice? This is a high bar, and it seems that there will be more indictments to come, so stay tuned. And we should can I add one thing on this? So the president's legal team is in big trouble over the last day. Maybe you know about this tweet that was written, I think it was on Saturday. Now the president's lawyer said that he tweeted it, and the tweet said, "I fired Flynn for lying to the vice president and for lying to the FBI," which suggests that President Trump knew that he lied to FBI before he then leaned on Comey to let the Flynn thing go. That's what opens Trump potentially more so to the obstruction of justice charges. So this was a huge screw up by the lawyer over the weekend.
We do have to be careful. There was an op-ed piece in the New York Times that, if he said something to Comey to take it easy on Flynn, that's not enough evidence to prove obstruction. A lot of people are screaming that, well, there you go. Yeah. That's obstruction. That's not legally defined obstruction, because as their analogy was, a minister might vouch for, a parishioner in the same, like, oh, he's a good guy, just let him off, he's been through enough kind of thing. A mom would plead for some, leniency on their son or daughter in the same way, that could be something that doesn't quite reach the level of obstruction of justice to try to stop an investigation that he's afraid will come back to him. And so they need a lot more evidence to start proving this. And so everybody needs to slow down a little bit on this.
And there's another point on this, that Trump's lawyer doubled down yesterday by giving an interview in which he said, essentially, that the president cannot be guilty of obstruction of justice.
That's not a winning argument.
No, and this has raised concerns now within the president's political team about the wisdom of the legal advice that he's getting, because by implication this means that the president can't be guilty of crimes. But remember, this is a society based on the rule of law. We have presidents rather than kings for a reason. Now, the lawyer cited a legal argument made by Alan Dershowitz at Harvard. Perhaps this is another reason why academics should stay out of politics. But the story coming out over the last couple of this is potentially a Hail Mary legal argument that doesn't have strong footing in constitutional foundations and legal foundations. And again, it reinforced the larger question in the president's political team: is he getting sound advice from his legal team?
It's a complete loser in the political realm.
Yeah,
it's a losing political argument. And so we'll have to stay tuned on this. And so there's more to come. But right now they're in some.
Yeah, and just so one thing to keep in mind as you're following this story: be very careful when you're watching sources and exactly what has said. And there is an urge to jump to conclusions on both sides, which is what happened with the ABC News story on Friday. check sources, double check across news organizations. The role of news organizations in this is to check each other's stories. Right. And people were citing ABC News and saying, oh, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. Right. It doesn't fit with what our sources are telling you, which opened up the problem. Force them to check each other.
Yeah, be skeptical and patient